Is This Home is my senior thesis exhibition. It explores my personal concept of home and how that can change over time. Up until a few years ago, I hadn't really thought too deeply about this topic. I had lived in the same house my entire life up until I moved away for college, and when that happened, my definition of home drastically changed. Leaving my childhood home, moving to a different city, and being on my own for the first time taught me a great deal about myself and what it means to call somewhere home. Through my work, I explore some of the various places I've called home and how they've changed over time. Going into thesis, I knew I wanted to include printmaking in some way. Before coming to Hastings College, I had very little experience with any type of printmaking. The most experience I had previously was making styrofoam prints in middle school. My freshman year of college, I took an introduction to printmaking class and quickly grew fond of the processes involved with printmaking. There are various forms of printmaking techniques, such as stencil, relief, intaglio, or lithography. In particular, I enjoyed the processes involved with relief printing the most. This technique of printmaking can be accomplished using wood, linoleum, or other carving materials. After drawing the design on the carving surface, it is then carved out using chisels and gouges. The uncarved, raised areas of the material make up the final design that will be printed. The raised surfaces are then rolled with ink, and finally the design is printed by pressing paper onto the inking surface, either by hand or with a printing press. The inking and pressing processes can be repeated several times to create identical prints. Relief printing is the earliest form of printmaking techniques, dating back to at least the Han Dynasty in China. Originally, it was used to produce multiple copies of manuscripts or books. After the printing press was invented in Europe around 1440, more artists turned to the technique as an art form. Albrecht Dürer is considered to be one of the masters of the woodcut medium during this time. His expert control of line made his work very detailed and highly desirable. Unlike Dürer, I used linoleum as a carving material throughout this entire process due to the ease of carving. Now, typically, lino cuts are printed on paper. However, I decided to do all of my printing on fabrics. Utilizing fabric allows me to additionally use embroidery, beading, and sewing in my pieces. I've always had an interest in textile arts, but never really pursued it as an actual art form. Growing up, I was very interested in sewing. My grandma and several of my aunts sewed, but my mom was one of the few women in her family who didn't. My older brother got me my first sewing machine when I was around 10 years old, and I mostly learned how to use it through trial and error. Even today, over a decade later, I'm still far from an expert. I enjoy the learning process though, and always aim to improve upon last time. Because I grew up with many talented seamstresses in my extended family, my childhood home was furnished with various forms of decorative fabric art. Hand-embroidered flowers, patchwork quilts, and cross-stitched families decorated the walls. Colorful, soft, and kitschy fabric art always reminds me of home. I draw inspiration from pieces made by family and attempt to recreate in my work the sense of home found in those pieces. Nostalgia plays a big role in how I remember my childhood home, and it helps shape the accompanying perception and memories. I wanted my pieces to have a surrealistic quality to them in order to represent that. Jill Adler, a Philadelphia-based artist, also makes art based on her childhood environments and how time has changed those environments. Her resulting work is uncanny. It's close to accurate, but always a bit off. As hard as we try, our memories alone will always be flawed. Before I started looking at where home was, I first needed to define what home actually means to me. Each person has a different definition of home, specific to their wants, needs, and experiences. What is home to one person may not be home to another. One of the most important qualities of home to me is familiarity in my surroundings. Routine creates a sense of comfort and belonging in a space. Leaving home for the first time was very challenging because I was losing the familiarity I had known for my entire life. This forced me to develop a new sense of home and create routines in an entirely different place. Home is more than just a roof over your head or a place to sleep. It needs to be somewhere that you feel safe and secure. A home should be a place that feels like yours, even if you don't physically own the space. Through personal belongings and decor, a space can be completely transformed. These elements were all important in analyzing past homes of mine. Growing up, I had no doubt in my mind about what home was. To me, home was the White House on the corner. Home was in Omaha, Nebraska, where my family lived. My household consisted of my parents, my 3 older siblings, and myself. I didn't grow up moving around, so this was the only home that I knew. I'm very lucky to have had a safe and stable home environment growing up, because I know many others cannot say the same. During my formative years, these factors all remained constant. I lived in that same house for the first 18 years of my life. Once I left my childhood home to move to Hastings and start college, my definition of home started to slowly change. This process was very gradual. I noticed myself referring to home as my dorm room or apartment more, and Omaha less. Every time I would visit my parents in Omaha, something would change. The big tree in the front yard that had been there longer than I had been alive got cut down. The rooms were repainted and furniture was moved around. I used to know every detail and every corner of this house, but that was no more. Earlier this school year, I was talking to my mom on the phone. I asked what was new with her and my dad, and she casually mentioned that they were getting their house painted that weekend. They were getting it painted a beautiful dark green. When she told me this, something in me switched. The White House on the corner was gone, and in a way, the house that I grew up in was gone. My parents' house will forever be a home to me, but it was in that moment I realized I had outgrown that space. This realization was conflicting to me. On one hand, I was saying goodbye to my childhood, but that also meant I was growing as a person and finding my own way in the world. Change is inevitable, and it happens to everyone. Every summer, my dad would plant tomatoes in the backyard. He had a small, overgrown garden near the street. We stored our firewood along the fence in the back and had a compost pile my brother started in the corner. We also used that place to store our garbage cans. Now, despite me hating tomatoes at the time, I would always get roped into helping with the garden. I have strong memories of standing barefoot on the hot driveway, watering the plants with our garden hose. Every year he'd start the plants in early spring, and every year we still wouldn't get ripe tomatoes until late August. Near the end of high school, my mom decided to take over the garden. She wanted to completely gut it and clean up the space. The summer before my senior year of high school, I helped her tear out weeds and roots and rotted wooden stakes. We planted a variety of flowers and added a bench, walkway, and solar lights. My mom's flower garden was the complete opposite of my dad's tomato garden. And to be honest, I hated that old tomato garden. I didn't like watering the plants or emptying the smelly compost, but seeing those metal tomato cages always reminded me of summers at home. When I look at my mom's garden, I appreciate the beauty that came out of that space and remember hot summers with my dad. This piece combines both gardens into one scene. Originally, it was just going to be about my mom's garden. However, I wanted to contrast my past memories of this space with the present to show the change and evolution that occurred. This piece, like many others, changed and evolved several times from my original concept. It was during this piece that I leaned more into surrealism because I wanted to communicate the nostalgia I felt. I contrasted the realistic garden elements with large, dreamlike florals to make it feel more surrealistic. While working on this piece, I was reminded of Deletta Martin. Martin is a mixed media artist who often layers drawings, prints, and patterned fabrics together. The patterned fabrics create focus and emphasis compared to the neutral toned prints. The first 3 years of college, I lived on the Hastings College campus. I lived in Taylor Hall my freshman and sophomore year, and the Bronco Village Apartments my junior year. In this piece, those buildings merge into each other, being separate physical spaces yet representing the same basic thing. During most of college, school was my home. I lived in these places for 9 months out of the year. In a way, these buildings served as a temporary home. My room had some of the qualities of a home, such as somewhere to sleep and store my belongings. It was a safe place to go at the end of the day. However, like any rented space, I was unable to fully make it my own. It was lacking some of the comfort and personalization of the home I had known before. Personal space was limited and shared. Even still, these rooms I occupied were important stepping stones to create my own space to call home. My final year of college, I moved into an apartment off campus with my boyfriend. After the past few years of transitions, moving, and anxiety, this was the first place since my childhood house that truly felt like a home to me. Being an off-campus apartment, I had much more freedom in my space than I had the previous years. We could decorate more and had our own space, like our own kitchen and garage. This apartment, in a way, was my first step into the real world. The left frame depicts the front door key to our apartment against the brick exterior of the building. I think keys are very impactful symbolically. Not only can they literally open doors, but they represent opening up possibilities, growth, and hope for the future. The right frame shows the exterior of our apartment building, namely our garage. The garage doors served more as a main entrance for us than the actual front door, and it was easily one of the building's most recognizable features due to the bright red color. When looking for apartments, I was drawn to this one in particular because the building looked less like a complex and more like a house. I think this shows the importance of visual appearance for what makes something feel like home. The central piece of my thesis project is a large patchwork quilt. This quilt is composed of fabric squares repurposed from my other pieces. This quilt is meant to tie all the pieces together and bring focus back to the central titular question, is this home? The house in the center of the quilt is intentionally non-specific. It's a generic square house with a triangle roof, similar to how a child might draw a house. It's meant to represent the abstract idea of home. Surrounding the house are all the different fragments of my other works, representing all the different concepts of home I have come to know. In other words, it's a conglomeration of all my most formative memories. This piece can be seen as my attempt to reconcile all these memories into one complete whole. This was definitely my biggest learning experience from this entire thesis process. Despite my years of sewing, I had never before attempted to make a quilt. Now, whenever I think of quilts, I always think of my maternal grandmother who passed away in 2017. She was a wonderful seamstress who loved quilting, and she was my first sewing inspiration. With her in mind, I wanted to attempt my first quilt. And even though she's not here today, I know she'd be proud of me and what I created. I pulled a lot of inspiration for this quilt from Jean Ray Laurie. Laurie was considered to be one of the first fine artists who moved to quilting as a medium of choice. The quilts that Laurie created were bold and colorful and far from traditional. She didn't use patterns for her quilt, but instead designed her own pieces. She also included silkscreen printmaking in some of her works. It was her mission to blur the line between fine art and decorative art, which is a sentiment I agree with. I didn't grow up around much fine art, but I was surrounded by decorative and folk art. I find comfort in these styles that are sometimes discredited as being unprofessional. Soon, I'm going to be graduating and saying goodbye to Hastings College, the place I've called home for the past several years. Already, I'm planning how to pack my belongings in preparation to move out of my apartment. I can visualize myself closing the door, getting in my car, and driving out of town for the final time. I've spent countless hours driving down I-80 in my Toyota Camry, trekking between Omaha and Hastings. My car has been a vital part of my college journey, serving as a tool to get me from home to temporary home. I plan to return to Omaha after leaving Hastings. Even though I grew up there, Omaha now seems unfamiliar to me. A lot has changed in my hometown over the past few years, and a lot has changed within myself. I'm an entirely different person than when I moved away for college. Now that it's time for me to return, I will be finding a new space to call home. I've wanted to make a print of my car's interior for a while now. This idea came to me during one of my many trips between Omaha and Hastings. This piece represents my unknown future, and although I'm unsure of what comes next for me, I'm optimistic about the possibilities. I want to thank everyone who supported me during my creative journey this year. Your love and encouragement are what kept me going and allowed me to create. This past year was tough, but that makes today all that more rewarding. I'm honored to have had the chance to share my work and artistic process with you all. Thank you. I'm now going to take 5 minutes to answer any questions you might have about my artwork or ideas.
Yes?
It seems like a
not really sure. Can you ask that again? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Is there like something that you like, that in your final product, like you like came to realize, like was it a part of your like original like idea of like what is home? Like did you realize something about like what home like meant in the end that you didn't realize at the beginning, basically?
It came to realize that home for me is a lot more about like the people that are surrounding it rather than the actual places. So even though this was all talking about places, I feel like what defines a place as home to me is a lot more influenced by the people I'm surrounded by. Yes?
So during this thesis process, I think I speak for a lot of people in thesis that we were all a little burnt out at a period
Yes.
of time.
Yes.
How are you going to deal with that moving on? Are you going to go to a different medium? Are you going to stick with printmaking? What are your thoughts?
So I love printmaking. I definitely think I'm going to stick with that, but I am very excited to be able to create things outside of academia and make things not for a specific purpose, not to even necessarily share with people, but just for myself. So I have a lot of ideas for stuff I want to really make that I've been putting off because this has been my main focus.
Do you plan on still trying to make other quilts?
Yeah, I think I really want to lean into quilt making more, especially all those photos of the ones that my grandma made. My aunt had sent to me the other day, and it was really inspiring to look at the pieces that my grandma had made. And I think especially since I'll be closer to all of my mom's sisters who sew, I think I'll be more encouraged to make quilts. Yes.
We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but what role do you see art playing in your life going further?
I think it's more going to be like a creative outlet for myself that doesn't necessarily need to be shared with people. Like I said, like so much of this process this entire year was making and sharing the exact ideas behind it with people. And even though I didn't share everything that went into it, it's exhausting to have to constantly explain. So I'm really excited for art to be more of a relief for me and not so much like a work. Yes?
Did you feel a need to edit yourself? Because you seem very aware that you had to share with people. Like, did you feel a need to edit yourself because of that? Or?
A little bit. Some of background surrounding home and kind of like my comfort with it aren't something that I entirely wanted to share with people. So it's showing a bit more of my positive relations to home. Yes.
Do you have any intention of exploring the other side of that, the less comfortable side of home?
I might sometime a bit more privately for myself try and make pieces about that. So.
Do you think you'll stick with the same medium pursuits or maybe do something more collaborative?
I'm open to doing more than what I experimented with this year. This year I was really trying to kind of push myself out of it. I went into it strictly thinking of just having printmaking be my medium of focus, and sewing wasn't as important. So throughout the process, I started incorporating a lot more mixed mediums into it, so I'd love to bring in some other styles that I haven't tried out yet. Thank you. Okay.